The story we know of the Beatles almost didn't happen. In a million different ways.
The story is miraculous. In order for it to happen, there are incredible amount of occurrences of good fortune. And you would think, well, that's unlikely.
We always sort of had this attitude in the Beatles, what are we going to do? And the answer was always, something will happen. Sometimes it took a few months to happen, you know.
By the end of 1961, the Beatles had been a band in one form or another for 4 years. They had played Hamburg, they had played the Cavern, but they had not yet made a record of their own.
No, we thought really all we wanted to do is make a record, you know, and just thought if we could make a record, well, we'll show Cliff and the Shadows. That's really was all our ambition at the time, is just to make a record.
We were punks, really. You know what I mean? We were like just these punks. We went in, we were all incredibly grateful to be on vinyl. You know, the idea of getting a record.
We kind of had a feeling that that's what we were going to do, and that, you know, we just felt that something good was going to happen. But then in those days, something good would just be, you know, getting to do a tour of Mecca ballrooms. Yeah, that was like a big deal.
By December of 1961, Brian Epstein had been their manager for less than a month. The only recording he had of the band was a Hamburg session from the previous summer. The Beatles' backing singer Tony Sheridan on an old folk tune called My Bonnie. With that record and some leverage from his record store's buying power, Brian got a meeting with EMI's general marketing manager Ron White, who promised to pass the record along to the label's senior producers. Norrie Paramore at Columbia, Walter Ridley and Norman Newell at HMV rejected the band without even granting them an audition, arguing they already had sufficient groups of this type.
Thank you, thumbs down, goodbye, you won't be needed. So that was it.
A fourth EMI producer, George Martin of Parlophone, was on holiday. He never heard the record.
We just wanted to make a record because we were still cocky enough to feel that all we needed was to make a record and we'd be okay. I mean, it was like blind faith.
EMI's rejection didn't stop Brian Epstein. He kept knocking on doors. Within weeks, he managed to get Mike Smith, a junior producer from Decca, to travel up to Liverpool and watch the Beatles play at the Cavern. Smith was impressed and offered them an audition in London. They set a date for January 1st, 1962.
So off we trundled to London, 3 o'clock in the morning. We're all drunk as lords in the middle of Trafalgar Square, enjoying ourselves, celebrating New Year's Eve with the imminent record audition the following day. But the beauty of it was we landed up late to it, but Mike Smith, who was actually in charge of the session, landed up late as well because he'd been celebrating himself.
They recorded 15 songs in about an hour. 3 of them were Lennon-McCartney originals.
We were a little bit nervous, even though we tried to play it down and, you know, keep it very low key. I think if you listen to the music, you can see that there's mistakes in there and there's excitement and, you know, voices crack and all this type of stuff.
And when you hear the tape, it's pretty good. You know, it's not great, but it's good. And it's certainly good for them.
And of course, at the end of it, we thought that we'd got the contract with Decca.
3 weeks later, Brian Epstein returned to London, where he received an answer from Dick Rowe. He would write of the meeting in his autobiography. Mr. Rowe, a short, plump man, said to me, "Not to mince words, Mr. Epstein, we don't like your boys' sound. Groups of guitarists are on the way out."
But those Decca tapes, we got turned down, and they instead hired Brian Poole and the Tremolos. That's the famous story. And somebody said to Brian Epstein, "Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein," and that was probably the biggest error in the music history.
At the time, people were really looking for Shadows-style groups. I think George Martin said that later, you know, that everyone was on the lookout for the new Shadows.
Brian took the Decca audition tapes and walked them around London, relentlessly looking for a label that would sign the Beatles.
So Brian then had this tape which he hawked around.
Pi Records turned them down after hearing the tape. Phillips rejected the band as well, although circumstances are unknown, and with Oriole, Brian simply couldn't secure a proper meeting.
Brian was a beautiful guy, Brian Epstein, and he was an intuitive, theatrical guy, and he knew we had something, and he presented us well.
John and I used to wait at Lime Street Station in a little coffee bar called Punch and Judy. We used to wait for Brian arriving back from London, and he'd come off the train, and we'd sort of take a look at his face, to see if it was like good news or bad. It was always bad. We'd have a cup of coffee and discuss what had happened. But he would just say, people aren't generally interested. It's going to be a hard sell,
When the Beatles first tried to get a recording contract, one of the reasons they struggled is because no one like that had ever existed before. It sounds so simple. I got drums, bass guitar, lead guitar, rhythm guitar, one, two, or three guys, or even all four, who sings in harmony and write their own songs. God, it's everywhere now. It was nowhere then, and it was so nowhere that no one could recognize that they were new and different.
Even their name was rejected.
When Brian Epstein was trying to get them a recording contract in London, everyone said to him, you've got to change the name because the word Beatles will never catch on.
Brian Epstein walked into my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name. So corny with an A.
When they go to London for the first time to promote themselves and they go around meeting journalists, people were openly hostile to them. Your name is horrible and you'll never make it and all that. And they, being the Beatles, they thought, right, we'll show you. And they never forgot. I mean, very tough-minded guys, the Beatles.
So I would say to the others, when they were depressed, or we were all depressed, thinking the group was going nowhere and this is a shitty deal and we're in a shitty dressing room, I'd say, where are we going, fellas? And they go, to the Pop County in pseudo-American voices. And I say, where's that, fellas? And they'd say, to the toppermost of the poppermost. I say, right. Then we'd all sort of cheer up.
We just thought, 200 Liverpool people can't be wrong. We'll show them.
Is it true that you originally auditioned for 2 record companies before you were finally signed by EMI Records?
Yeah, we made tapes for Decca and I think
Pi.
Yeah, but we didn't actually go to Pi.
In fact, EMI turned us down first of all. They did.
Yeah,
You may laugh.
Don't blame him after hearing the tape.
And then George Martin, he's from EMI. He decided to sign us up just himself, you see.
Brian Epstein had been carrying the Decca audition tape all over London. It finally reached the only producer at EMI who hadn't heard his pitch 7 months earlier.
Brian Epstein walked into my office one day and said he'd got a group that he wanted me to hear. Brian had apparently taken one of his tapes into the EMI store in Oxford Street to get it transferred to disc. And the engineer heard it and thought it was very good.
The engineer actually worked for EMI's publishing arm. During that transfer, he became highly interested in securing the copyright for the Lennon-McCartney original, Like Dreamers Do.
Brian told him how he'd been to every record company in the country and hadn't gotten anywhere with it. And he saw me because I had a reputation at that time for being rather screwball and rebellious, and I would take any nutty thing like the Beatles.
In reality, management handed George Martin a directive: sign the band, as a corporate compromise to satisfy the publishing department.
Every label in the country had turned them down. I think perhaps if I'd known that, I might have turned them down too, but I didn't.
On June 6, 1962, the Beatles stepped inside EMI Studios for the very first time and met George Martin.
It was a little intimidating, but he seemed like a nice bloke, and we knew he'd done the Peter Sellers stuff, so we could relate through the Goons. He'd done a lot of comedy records that we'd liked.
I was looking for the Cliff Richard or the Elvis Presley or the Tommy Steele, saying, now, is Paul going to be the main one or is John going to be the main one? And George, well, he's obviously not got such a good voice as the other two. And then it suddenly hit me right between the eyes. Why the hell should I find a solo singer? Why not just have the lot of them as they are? It wasn't their music that sold them to me. It was their charm. They were very charming people.
So I think George quite liked the way we had about us. I don't think he was that convinced about our musical ability just then.
He didn't actually want to sign them. He actually had his arm twisted to sign them. But as soon as he met them, because he signed them before he met them, as soon as he met them, he knew that they were original.
There was one thing about the Beatles that George Martin would not accept. He did not want their drummer on the record.
It's one of those moments that you see dramatized, you know, where the group's at mates and everything, and the big producer just wants two of them.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
And we'd seen Ringo, and we really admired Ringo. We actually thought Ringo was the best drummer in Liverpool. And then the first night we played with Ringo, just something clicked.
3 weeks later, the new lineup went down to London to record their first single.
And they came in, and they came into the studios, and it was like electricity. You know, they had this wonderful atmosphere. They had tremendous charisma. They had no great songs with them, but they gave you the feeling that you felt so good for being with them. Mm-hmm. And when they left, you felt as though something had gone away, you know.
It took about 8 months to get to the stage where we had a recording contract and we were having the first record issued.
By autumn 1963, the Beatles had released 3 #1 singles in the United Kingdom. But in America, they were still practically unknown. EMI's American subsidiary, Capitol Records, turned down every single record they were offered.
The first time we had Please Please Me became a hit, we sent it over to Capitol Records, which EMI owned, and said, "Can you please release this record?" And they said, "Sorry, it wouldn't mean anything in this country." And we were a bit disappointed, but we should really know their own market. We're only English, we don't really know.
Capitol's gatekeeper for British acts was producer Dave Dexter Jr. He listened to Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You. He passed on all of them, believing they were not suitable for American audiences.
And then when the second record came out, he said, "Well, you try this one. You know, this is a good one. You know, you guys really don't know how to make American records. I'm afraid it's not very good."
Well, obviously one's thought about America in connection with the Beatles for a long time, because I was always quite sure that really the Beatles would make it big over there. We were all rather perturbed about it because we seemed to be issuing the records and nothing much was happening.
Because America was no more prepared to accept what the Beatles were than the English market was. They had to force their way in, but once people heard them, that was enough, because the music did the rest.
It took a long time to break through, and I think today it takes a long time to break through with anything that's really important. Nothing that's really important is broken through very quickly.
Looking back, every closed door, every rejection was steering them toward the exact path they were meant to walk. If Decca had signed them, the label would have controlled their repertoire, forcing them to record songs written by other people.
What happened to the group they did sign, which was Brian Poole and the Tremolos, who eventually had hits, but their first hit was Twist and Shout, which they did because the Beatles had done it. They were given songs to perform, their name was misspelled on the record labels, and they were forced to do 2 albums of hits of other people, which maybe the Beatles, had they been signed instead, would have had to do.
If Capitol had taken the earliest singles, Love Me Do might have been their American debut, and perhaps their American end.
How lucky George Martin was to have the Beatles, and how lucky the Beatles were to have George Martin, and how lucky we all were that they came together in the most unlikely fashion.
I always believed that something would turn up, that it would be all right.
From beginning to end, A to Z on the Beatles thing is only a 10-year period, really. Boy, did we come a long way in 10 years. So, I mean, we literally came from the back streets of Liverpool to the front streets of America.
And it wasn't until after a year had passed that eventually the gradual build-up of the Beatles and the fame that they created in England got through to the American press. And it happened at a time when eventually Capitol couldn't resist it. And when I Want to Hold Your Hand came along, they knew darn well they couldn't refuse that one. It was just impossible.
There were so many times when the Beatles almost didn't happen.
Ladies and gentlemen,
and yet everything happened at the right time.
The Beatles! Close your eyes and I'll kiss you